Many times over the past decades, it has been pointed out to me by critics and colleagues and friends, friendly and unfriendly, that I seem to identify urban religion exclusively with the religious practices of poor and working class people and with immigrants and migrants. Does urban religion not include, I'm asked, upper class Episcopalians, Unitarians who are also Buddhists? Is there not as much urban religion on Lower Park Avenue as there is on Upper Park Avenue? When middle and upper class people do come within my historical frame, moreover, I seem inevitably to describe them as either yearning for the occult powers of the poor in a kind of spiritual slumming, or else as trying to take control of the religious practices of the poor and working class people under the aegis of reform or the guise of urban planning. Certain not fully examined assumptions about social class and religion appear to be operative here. So while I include African American storefront Pentecostal churches within the purview of urban religion, for instance, I appear to be less interested in the more prosperous, politically influential African American churches of the mainline denominations, pastored by prominent seminary-educated men. Is Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church not as much a part of urban religion as the Fruit of Islam standing outside it on Sunday mornings fishing for members? Or Black Baptist churchwomen teaching correct social manners and religious comportment to newly arrived Southern migrants in the 1920s and 30s? Are they not as much a part of urban religion as the migrants themselves? Sometimes I hoped it would be enough simply to respond, yes, to such queries and leave it at that. But I acknowledge that these persistent questions raise substantive issues about religion, urbanism, and modernity. And so I thought I would use the occasion of this lecture to revisit them and to consider what is at stake in these comments, which is to say, what is at stake in researching religion in New York City. Two preliminary discussions are in order before I get to the Gods of Gotham, with gods here and throughout tonight standing for all the special beings with whom city people are in relationship. Demons, ghosts, spirits, the Holy Spirit, ancestors, Father Divine, angels, saints, the dead, and so on. So whenever I use the word gods, I'm referring to a whole panoply of special beings that human beings are in relationship to. The first of these preliminary discussions has to do with the urban part of urban religion. So I'm going to take apart the concept urban religion, break it into its two pieces, discuss each of the two pieces, and then return to the subject. So, basic to my understanding of the history of religions in New York is the social organization of New York City's spatial environment that began to take shape before the Civil War, continued afterwards, and remained in place into the post-World War II era. Over the course of these 100-plus years, New York became not simply a city of neighborhoods, but a city of diverse and distinct lived religious and social worlds that were largely incomprehensible and often invisible to each other. And this will be familiar to some of you, in colonial-era towns, the proprietors of small businesses and factories lived alongside their workers, sometimes in the same houses. But in the early republic, during the nation's first industrial revolution, the new urban middle class instituted a sharp distinction between the spaces of work and home. They moved out of city quarters, filling up with immigrants, migrants, and workers, to more pleasant and tranquil areas outside the city, just then becoming accessible on expanding transportation lines. The new class mapping of the city carried heavy moral and cultural significance. The urban center became the place of competition and work, and the domain of lascivious, sensuous, uncontrolled, and dangerous lower orders. This was in contrast to the domestic world of the upper middle class periphery, which was the space of nurture, civility, pious and proper femininity, and propriety. Center and periphery were not very far apart in New York in miles, but they were very far apart in other ways. Think of what the term inner city conjures up even today. Even today, when the inner city is changing, The term still, I think, has some of the traces of this history. It bears some of the traces of this history. So these divisions persisted and deepened over time as immigrants and migrants from Ireland and Germany, from Southern and Eastern Europe, from the Caribbean and the American South came to the city in search of work. This fact that New York was a city of mutually uncomprehending groups divided by class, culture, and race has shaped all aspects of the city's history, including its religious history. From the very start, religious difference was a key marker of urban neighborhoods. The mutual incomprehensibility of urban groups to each other was ontological as well as social and racial. Religious difference contributed fundamentally to the making of the meanings of poor and working class neighborhoods, to the meanings of inner city, just as the class stratification of New York streets and neighborhoods intensified perceptions of religious difference. What made working class quarters so terrifying in antebellum New York was not only that they were dark, unhealthy, and dangerous, but also that they were largely Irish and Catholic. The arrival of tens of millions of Catholics over the 19th and early 20th centuries, most of them settling in cities, a vast number of them in New York, forever changed the religious landscape of urban America generally, of New York City in particular. It also changed American identity. Irish and German Catholics did not arrive in a Protestant nation in the antebellum period. The United States became a Protestant nation because Catholics arrived in it. It was when they were confronted with the Catholic other in the nation's cities that anxious journalists and historians reconceptualized the country's fundamental identity as Protestant. The long history of hatred and violence between Catholics and Protestants is beyond the scope of this lecture tonight. But perhaps I can summarize it for my purposes in its American version with a comment my dissertation advisor, the great American religious historian Sidney Ahlstrom, once made to me. He said, the United States does not have anti-Catholic movements. The United States is an anti-Catholic movement. Protestant-Catholic hatred erupted with considerable force in New York City as soon as the magnitude of the Irish immigration became clear. And over the years, as more and more Catholics arrived, it got tangled up with absolutely everything. With the Civil War draft, with the labor movement, with prohibition, municipal government, crime, the police force, public transportation, who could forget Mike Quill, a hero among my relatives, the great Catholic subway, the head of the subway union, whom my relatives just really admired, in part because of his stance on labor, but also because he was a Catholic. The founding of the city's hospitals and the treatment of the sick and the poor. All of that was inflected by Irish Protestant tensions, Catholic Protestant tensions. The arrival of the Catholic Irish, and this is a thesis that we can talk a little bit about in the question and answer period if you're interested in if you have objections to it. The arrival of the Catholic Irish was modern New York's first encounter with the shock of religious difference, and the waves radiating out from this shock heightened Protestant Catholic tensions in New York City and elsewhere in the 1830s and 1840s. In 1844, to cite one dramatic instance of this, New York Archbishop Dagger John Hughes threatened to burn the city to the ground if Protestant mobs attacked Catholic churches as they were doing in Philadelphia. Men and women of other religions took up residence in New York neighborhoods over the following century, of course, and their presence, along with Catholics of various ethnicities, gave rise to the perception in the rest of the country that New York did not really belong to Protestant America. Casting New York as a demon-haunted landscape has been a staple of conservative, best-selling, evangelical Christian horror fiction and pornography from the antebellum period to today. Former pro-baseball player turned popular evangelist Billy Sunday had New Yorkers in mind when he warned God in the 1920s to wear gloves, rubber gloves, when dealing with city people. But the foundational religious difference of American urbanism generally, of New York City in particular, was that between Protestants and Catholics. Which brings me now to the religion part of urban religion, the second preliminary topic before I get to the Gods of Gotham. Now, I apologize in advance, which gives you a sense of where we're going. I apologize in advance for the density and pace of what follows. I am taking a necessary detour here through the modern history of the word religion that will eventually bring me back to the streets and neighborhoods of New York, but eventually. The word religion, and in my notes here I have quotation marks around religion, which you can't see, and I could go like this every time, but that would really slow me down and be, I think, inelegant if I kept doing this. So from now on, when I use the word religion, assume that there are scare quotes around it. The word religion, in its contemporary usage, is of relatively recent origins. Its familiarity, the familiarity of the word religion masks the word's history. Religion, as in freedom of religion, or in Religion and Belief, the title of the New York Times column on the subject, or in Poll Finds Americans Still Confused About Barack Obama's Religion, a recent New York Daily News headline. That word, religion, took shape amid the seismic shifts in world history in the 17th and 18th centuries. It arose in the context of internecine violence between Catholics and Protestants as the primacy of Catholicism gave way first in Europe and then globally to competing religions. In the same period, Europeans used religion for the practices they were encountering among the peoples of the New World, Asia and Africa, that looked like Catholicism and Protestantism, although most often these heathen practices looked most like Catholicism, both to Catholics and to Protestants, although they thought differently about them. And in turn, over time, these distant peoples adopted the word religion for their own ends in dealing with Europeans and Americans. Then philosophers in the 17th century, in reaction against Europe's religious violence and newly cognizant of the diversity of the world's gods, developed a notion of religion as, and here I'm going to list its main characteristics, the main characteristics of modern religion: universal, non-denominational, rational, ethical, mildly monotheistic, with a God politely absent from the domains of politics and commerce, of natural origins, and thus common to all humans. That is modern religion. This universal religion looks surprisingly like a refashioned Protestant Christianity, which is why Orthodox Jews in the 19th century and conservative Catholics in the 20th century accused their modernizing counterparts of Protestantizing their respective traditions. This was a critique of Reform Judaism. They're Protestantizing it. And there's truth to that critique, that what they were doing was moving Judaism towards a more recognizably modern, meaning this religion that I've anatomized. Religion in this sense then got taken up in the revolutionary social transformations of the 18th century when it was codified into constitutional law. It was deployed in diplomacy, as when Americans demanded freedom of religion from Imperial Japan after the siege in 1853 by Admiral Matthew C. Perry, the former commander of the New York City Naval Yard, and theorized by scholars of religion who identified religion as the highest form of religion generally, the apex and endpoint of all human religious development towards which all peoples at different paces, with the possible exception of Catholics, were evolving. This progression was said to go hand in hand with social developments. The society's technological expertise, scientific knowledge, medical learning, and morality developed in tandem with various forms of religion so that you could discern the status of one in the others. In other words, religion pretends to be a descriptive word, that is religion, when in fact it is a prescriptive word, that is religion, but that is not religion. The that is not religion has been named variously over time: magic, superstition, enthusiasm, sex, cults, popular religion, and so on, and has included behaviors that bourgeois moderns, not only in the West, but nearly everywhere, find appalling, silly, or disgusting. Usually anything sensuous or embodied, like kissing or licking sacred objects, or asking the gods for fertility, either for oneself or one's crops or one's animals. Transgressive, as when a Yoruba spirit mounts a voodoo practitioner and more or less erases that human's particular subjectivity so that he or she becomes the embodiment of the spirit. Socially improper or undignified, getting drunk with the gods. Or illegal, killing animals and sacrificial rites. What much of the that is not religion shares is, to what modern eyes, is the confusion of things meant to be kept distinct. The spiritual and the material, humans and non-humans, different subjectivities, the past and the present, the living and the dead, the sacred and the profane. Anything that mixes these categories, anything that blurs these beloved distinctions, comes under, at some point, the category of magic, superstition, cult, sect, and so on. So, for example, when I describe to students the practice among Catholic pilgrims at a Bronx shrine to Our Lady of Lourdes of putting holy water into their car's radiators to ensure safe travel, or I show them pictures of Italian immigrants pinning dollar bills on long ribbons hanging from saint statues during Italian-American street festivals, they are quick to identify these behaviors as not religious. And perhaps you think that too, because after all, you're moderns. We can take. I was actually going to start the lecture with a test, but then I thought, no, that's just much too aggressive. I was going to say, how many of you think the following is good modern religion or not? But these things are so embedded in us that I think it was too easy. Anyway, these practices, like pouring holy water into a car radiator, just get that into your head. These practices cross realms, kept distinct according to modern notions of religion. And by now it should be clear that there are only modern notions of religion. They keep separate. They blur the distinction between the mechanical and the spiritual in the case of the radiator, dirt and cleanliness, the transcendent and the sordid domain of money in the case of students get all puritanical when they see money pinned, as if religion is ever free of money. But there's something about this image of those dollar bills on saints' robes that really is offensive. The most closely guarded boundary of modern religion, and the one that caused the most distress, even horror, when it was breached, was the here of human life and the transcendent there of the place of the gods. In other words, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. What the very terminology of religious exclusion, cult, sex, superstition, and so on, share is that the ones accused of being superstitious are those that take the gods, in all the senses that I mean that, to be present to people in the circumstances of their everyday lives. And not only present, but there to be pleaded with, touched, accused, seen, and heard. In statues, for instance, in stones, water, in the spirit of a dead Rebbe, and so on. This is the essential boundary that is breached, the idea that the supernatural is present in the spaces of everyday lives to be contended with, talked to, argued with, punished when necessary, pleaded with, and so forth. So this is the essential boundary of modern religious consciousness. For a web of political, social, colonialist, and racist reasons, that is not religious came to be associated with the working class, with poor people, with people of color, with South Asian religions, women, children, and uneducated people, those who did not know the real, meaning scientific causes of events in the world, for example, and above all, with Catholics. Catholicism was the template in the modern world for the that is not religion, because Catholics were the paradigmatic people of holy presence. They were the ones who thought that their host was God's real body and blood there in people's mouths, and that the saint was in some way present in the statue, that the holy figure is present in relics. This was not acceptable in modern understandings of religion. But just as, say, gender is a fluid category, so that maleness, femaleness is not identical with the lived realities man, woman, so too the use of religion as a normative descriptor was not limited to white men or to non-Catholics. All moderns, including African Americans, Jewish and Catholic moderns, deployed this notion of religion as a way of commenting on and of evaluating their respective religions. So, for example, in 1933, during the first wave of the Great Migration of Southern African Americans to northern cities, two African American scholars with leadership positions in mainline black Christian denominations, Benjamin E. Mays and Joseph W. Nicholson, published a study of the Negro Church, funded, as they called it, funded by the New York City-based and Rockefeller-funded Institute for Social and Religious Research. Mays and Nicholson surveyed 609 urban black churches and 185 rural ones, and concluded that the distinctive religious styles of Southern migrants to the north, which were rooted in the non-denominational holiness Pentecostal movement that swept the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, represented a threat to the prospects for progress among black Americans in modern America, among African Americans in modern America. This way of being religious, they said, represented an obstacle to the future development of African America. The Southern migrants brought an alien religious sensibility to the modern city, said Mays and Nicholson. The authors were clearly uncomfortable with how Southern holiness Christians moved their bodies in church and how vocal and demonstrative they were. It would be better for black America, Mays and Nicholson argued, if instead of joining small, spirit-filled storefront churches that were proliferating by the score in cities around the country, African American Christians pooled their financial resources, chose university-educated leaders, and dedicated themselves to moral and economic advancement with the appropriate and commensurate religious behavior. That was their suggestion at the end of the book. So behave. Behave religiously. Mays and Nicholson were talking about African Americans, but much the same language was used in this period by Irish Catholic middle class, the Irish Catholic middle class about Southern Italian religious ways, and by Reformed Jews, most of them descendants of German Jews who had arrived in the United States in the mid-19th century, about the religious practices of the Lower East Side Eastern European Jews. So this was very common language in all of these communities. So we're back to New York. We have at last made our way back to New York City. Obviously, much of what went on religiously in working class, immigrant, and migrant communities in Harlem or the Lower East Side, in Italian Harlem, in Chinatown, and so on, was the that is not of religion. This is why the religious practices of these neighborhoods and peoples had gone largely missing from the religious history of New York and other American cities until relatively recently. The Lower East Side synagogues reeking of herring, for example, or the street festivals of Italian immigrants stinking of garlic, or the storefront Pentecostal churches musty with the fug of poverty and sweat, sin and repentance, and with the excitement of the Spirit's presence. Obviously, smell is essential in marking and making the presence of the urban religious other in the spaces of the city. None of these were thought to belong to urban religion. So, confronting this dilemma, a number of us, scholars of religion in the city, sought to invert the meanings of the word religion, to turn its history upside down, and to put in the place of the urban religious what had for so long been invisible or marginalized, as in works on African American urban sects and cults, or that had been slotted into the story that the phrase modern religion tells about time, which is that such religious practices are vestiges of vanishing worlds destined themselves to disappear, as in the Lower East Side world of our fathers. But the gods did not disappear. Immigrants and migrants brought their gods out onto the streets, stoops, parks, and fire escapes of New York City, and to the places where major avenues intersected, and they raised their temples and churches into its skies, forever altering both the city's landscape and the lived experience of the city. There was nothing reticent about the religious practices of these communities. In the years I am talking about, when New York was a city of industry, manufacturing, entertainment, and commerce, it was also a city of religious spectacle. New and unfamiliar religious customs, costumes, rituals, and imagery, new and unfamiliar, that is, within the prescribed and anxious limits of modern religion, appeared throughout New York's working class and immigrant and migrant neighborhoods with a flamboyance that matched the ebullient mood of modernism itself. The immigrants and migrants introduced their children to their gods, and in turn their children found or improvised in the city new versions of the old gods or new gods like the old gods, and introduced them in turn to their immigrant and migrant parents. I am thinking here of Father Divine, for example, the popular early 20th century African-American religious figure whose followers took him to be God in the flesh, or Wallace D. Fard, the Detroit immigrant who introduced Elijah Muhammad to Islam and eventually acquired himself the aura of the divine. Such intergenerational exchanges, which were fraught with ambivalent emotions on both sides, contributed to the ongoing vitality of the gods in the city, belying the assumption of the gods' expiration date. All of this was modern New York City, and all of it comes under the title urban religion. Being in relationship with the gods, again with God standing in for the array of supernatural beings in the city, did not isolate men, women, and children from their everyday circumstances or environments in a sort of pre-modern bubble. The gods plunged them into modern urban life. New Yorkers appropriated public venues for themselves and their gods, and it was in the company of their gods that they encountered the challenges of modern urban life. Immigrant Catholics took the saints, the body of Christ in the consecrated host, or the Blessed Mother, into the streets of their neighborhoods, into their hospitals and sick rooms. Pentecostals sang and gave praise on city corners. The Pan-African Messiah Marcus Garvey made his way through the streets of Harlem in great parades, and Jews said Taklish beside a city river at the commencement of the year's beginning. In this way, the gods brought their New York devotees into direct encounter with municipal authorities and urban reformers, whose vision of the modern city did not include such public spectacles of piety or an abundance of gods, and who used the tools of their bureaucratic offices to discipline and contain them. Control of the streets was essential to the making of modern cities and to the struggles, to the religious histories of the city. New York streets were a problem, not only to Americans who cherish an idealized vision of the nation as an agrarian democracy, or to middle-class Christian reformers who feared the city's moral contagion, but to modernists as well, and for similar reasons. As the great 20th century visionary of the modern city, Le Corbusier, put it, quote, "The street wears us out. And when all is said and done, we have to admit, it disgusts us." This from the man who, in many ways, is responsible for, when Mayor Bloomberg recently talked about turning 78 city blocks in the middle of Manhattan into Taiwan, in terms of the scale of its urban development with large buildings, that was Le Corbusier's vision. That was the vision. Tall towers connected in Corbusier's vision above the streets, because he hated the streets and he hated what went on the streets. It was the density and diversity of human presence in the streets, in particular of working class men, women, and children, acting out their intolerable propensities in public, that made the streets so dangerous, so threatening to upper and middle class observers, and so evidently disgusting to Le Corbusier. The gridding of New York in 1811 was meant to impose order on the city's chaotic thoroughfares, turning them into efficient conduits of commerce and finance. The gridding also had implications as well for the kinds of relationships that might take place in New York. There were no central meeting places on the grid, no places to stop and talk, to congregate, or to sit back and to watch the play of urban life. The process of transforming the lived experience of the city continued when the grids rose up into the skies as skyscrapers, dwarfing the streets and leaving the people and the streets far behind. But the immigrants and migrants and their children, the city's working classes, pushed back against this development, getting permits for religious buildings and street celebrations, contending with the apprehensions and hostilities of neighbors and their curiosity, sanctifying urban spaces with the necessary rituals inherited or invented, adapted for city life, fighting over place with others of the same faith but from different parts of the world, as in Irish and Italian Catholics, or with people of different faiths, all of this brought the gods of the city into direct engagement with the realities of urban power and place. African American ministers and Roman Catholic priests and nuns have been especially connected to the urban environment. Malcolm X, for example, who is a master of the art of being present in the streets, loved walking Harlem. Catholic identity was so thoroughly articulated to urban space that Catholics identified their neighborhoods by the names of the patronal saints of their local churches, so that they would say, they didn't say, I came from this part of the Bronx, such and such street or such avenue. Of course, you all know this. They would say, I come from St. Cecilia's, or I come from St. Joe's, or I come from renaming the spaces of the city into the names of their holy figures. Catholic priests and nuns roamed New York in their distinctive garb, extending the moral authority of the church into saloons, parks, and public transportation and candy stores. Their presence has been especially evident in times of social crisis. Again and again in times of social crisis. But just to take one example, during the 1832 cholera epidemic in New York City, for example, which struck with particular virulence where Irish immigrants and African Americans lived, the visible courage of Sisters of Charity in caring for the sick and dying at great personal risk left a lasting impression on the city's memory. So ways of being religious said to be irrelevant to the life of the modern city were actually fundamental to the making of the distinctive religious sensibilities of modern urban people, more broadly to American popular culture, which is to say more broadly to American culture itself. The arrival of spirit-filled Southern black migrants, who were at first rejected in black denominations in the North, forever changed the style not only of modern African American Christianity, but also of black popular music and dance, and the music industry in the United States, and then finally of all global music. Italian American devotions proved to be particularly compelling visually and thematically to American novelists and filmmakers. Think here of the closing sequence of The Godfather when sacrament and murder twist around each other, Carmela's piety in The Sopranos, Madonna's music video Like a Virgin, or the many, many scenes of young men praying in Martin Scorsese's films. The That Is Not Religious of modernity contributed a distinctive edge to popular culture in the United States and to the look and feel of the American urban secular. One of the greatest articulations of the religious world of Southern black migrants was James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, an autobiographical novel based on Baldwin's Southern holiness childhood. Here is a description of Lenox Avenue on the morning after the Holy Spirit has burned through the Temple of the Fire Baptized, the storefront church that Baldwin's fictional migrant Grimes family attends, told from the perspective of the younger John Grimes, Baldwin's fictional self. Quote, "And the avenue, like any landscape that has endured a storm, lay changed unto heaven, exhausted and clean and new. Not again, forever, could it return to the avenue it had once been. Fire or lightning or the latter rain coming down from these skies, which moved with such pale secrecy above, had laid yesterday's avenue waste, had changed it in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, as all would be changed on the last day when the skies would open once more to gather up the saints. Harlem lay changed under heaven, and it could never return to the avenue it had once been. The Holy Spirit had passed over the street, the latter rain had fallen, and once the gods of the poor and working class of migrants and immigrants had arrived and taken up residence in the city, New York would become a distinct sort of modern city, transformed by these presences and changed under heaven." So, to return here at the end to the critics whose voices opened this discussion, once again, I have said nothing here about, for example, New York City advertising executive Bruce Barton's 1925 bestseller, The Man Nobody Knows, which reimagined Jesus as a virile and masterful businessman and bon vivant, a sort of proto-John Galt, or about the settlement house movement, which drew young middle class and upper class Protestants to moral service in the city. I've said nothing about religious involvement in Great Society programs, and in turn about the impact of the federal government on religion in the 1960s and 1970s in the cities. I've said nothing about anti-Vietnam War protests, about Adam Clayton Powell Jr., for example, another example, scion of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, who combined the religious, political, and erotic with such distinctive flair, and so on. That is to say, once again, I have said nothing about recognizably modern ways of being religious in the city. So I am kind of back where I started. But I propose, in conclusion, that we hold on to the distinction that I have developed between the way of the gods on the one hand, which I have identified with the city's working classes and with immigrants and migrants in their neighborhoods, and modern religion on the other, whose exclusionary history I have described. In other words, I propose retaining, for heuristic and historiographical reasons, the distinction between the that is not religion and the that is religion of modernity. If we do so, if we hold these two in tension, I think we will be able to understand urban religion more comprehensively as what happens when people coming from neighborhoods that are also the domains of different gods and of different ways of being in the world meet each other on the city streets, in their law courts, settlement houses, poverty programs, amid racial divisions, in parks and schools, and in the streets. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
If any of you have questions for Professor Orsi, somebody will be running around to give you a microphone. Yes? Here?
There's also mics at the aisle.
Also mics in the front and in the aisles, yes, so that we can all hear your question and that Professor Orsi can answer it. Who's first?
You know, one of the things I tell my students while you're thinking about whether you want to ask me a question, I tell students who all come with a normative idea of religion in their heads. I mean, everybody has this normative idea in their head. So they all come with this. I tell them that if it doesn't offer the opportunity to lick something, kiss something, eat something, or put something in your mouth, it's not a religion. And if they're willing to buy that, then we can really have a good semester together. If not, then I have to spend the entire semester unpacking the normative understanding of religion that is so influential. Everybody is waiting for religious people to act morally in some way or to behave themselves in certain ways, and that's not the point.
Yes.
I just want to say your talk was very interesting. And if I could put it in quotes myself, I would have to consider you the Willy Wonka of urban religion, the way you described everything. Very colorfully and candy wrapped, and just very interesting take on everything that you put together.
Some of your programs have candy tickets in them, and
right. I actually found one, so I'm looking forward to a free seminar with you at some point. My question is the way the world is today, with the vast fightings of the different religions and the issues that all the religions have with each other and with themselves. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what do you feel is like the solution to all these problems with not only religion but within the cities, all the problems that the cities face? I'm just wondering, do you have any? I mean, I know it's a pretty broad question, but I'm just wondering if you have any input in maybe what you feel might be a solution to all the issues facing urban religion and cities in general.
I don't know. Thank you for that question. I don't know that I have a solution for religious tensions or religious violence. I would say that the distinction that I developed is important for policymakers and others. It's important, although it's impossible, actually. So a number of acquaintances of mine and colleagues are involved in a project at the State Department, trying to get the State Department to understand the difference between these two kinds of religion. Broadly speaking, these two categories of religion that I've developed here, that is religion, that is not religion in the modern world. Because very often, American foreign policy initiatives in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth are very much predicated on that distinction, with the idea that that is not religion, is what is not acceptable and needs to eventually disappear. And I think it would be helpful to keep in mind that's already in that's ready to bring a set of assumptions about what good religion is to the table. And it simply means that what's going to happen is that the work of diplomacy then, as it was in Japan and other places, is going to be to try to bend other people to this normative distinction. And I think it's useful to keep these in mind, but the one account of religion that I was calling modern religion is so normative and so powerful that this message does not get through. So I don't know. I don't know. But you hear it all the time evoked in political contexts. When the word religion is meant, the word is the first thing that I excavated, this thing that has a history from the 16th century forward. It's not licking, kissing, touching, dancing, eating. Or, I mean, I don't mean to paint the gods as benign. I mean, I think the gods also ask. I think to be in relationship with the gods also puts people in some very, very morally challenging positions. And what people do in relationship to the gods is not always good, but they're doing it in relationship to the gods.
Yeah, surveys show that perhaps as many as 40% of New York City residents no longer subscribe to a particular denomination, or they're not churchgoers. In polls or surveys, they are not identified or don't identify themselves with any religion. So where do they fit in?
Right. Well,
are they a religion?
Those polls measure certain identifiable characteristics of modern religion. Regular church attendance, for example, or or donations. I knew an economist once who was trying to work out an algorithm to figure out, this was for investment banking purposes, to figure out if you could determine the relative economic stability and future visions of societies based on the level of religious donations that they make to their churches or temples. But that's what I mean by one set of criteria that are being applied. You know, many New Yorkers are in relationship to supernatural beings in all kinds of ways. I mean, so there's a cemetery in the Bronx that I have been doing some work on. If you go to this cemetery, now it is admittedly a Catholic cemetery. This kind of behavior, though, always falls underneath the radar of such surveys. So if you go to this cemetery, which is in the northeast Bronx, I was approaching my mother's, where my mother is buried there, and I was approaching the people who are buried in walls. There are these 4 walls of tombs, and then the walls are open to the air. So there's air circulating through them, and you actually enter through these four sides. And as I was approaching this one day a couple of years ago, I heard this odd sound, this sort of tinkling, sort of singing, tinkling sound. And I thought, what is that? And I walked in to this little courtyard that the 4 walls open onto. And what it was people had taped, you know those greeting cards that when you open them they play songs? People had taped these greeting cards to the front of the tombs of their relatives. And the greeting cards had messages on them. The greeting cards were meant to communicate with the dead in some way. If you take a survey of New York Catholics, that behavior is not going to show up on a survey because that's behavior that is sort of disallowed within the frameworks of the normative modern. So that's not going to show up. And I don't know if those people go to church or not, but I can tell you they're going and writing messages to the dead. If you're willing to count that as religion, then there's probably more religion in New York than those surveys can gain access to.
Hi, I'm curious where you would put schools I mean, there's religion in quotation marks and there's religion without quotation marks. But parochial schools, for instance, are profoundly central to children and to certainly the mothers and parents and to the parish. How does that fit in your spectrum of different kinds of religion?
Parochial schools were, children were formed in very deep ways in parochial schools. Their imaginations, their interiorities, their subjectivities, however you want to put this, were formed in very deep ways towards the realness of the gods present to them. The nuns and the priests enacted and performed this in all kinds of ways, so that I was talking to somebody recently about holy cards. I was talking to Nadia, in fact, about holy cards, and how holy cards just, which are, I mean, they've been around in some form or another for ages, but in their most recognizable modern form are kind of mid-19th century, and then they pick up, and then when that 3D technology enters, it's a whole new era of holy cards. So you could sort of move the card and have a little mini vision of your own by tilting the card one way or the other. Those cards move through Catholic schools, and they're the base. They're like the currency of Catholic schools. They're the relationship between. They mark the relationship between nuns and children and so forth. So the kind of religion that I'm talking about, religion without the quotation marks, was all over Catholic schools. I mean, that to some extent was one of the reasons why Americans were afraid of them. Protestant Americans and other Americans were afraid of Catholic schools because they knew that Catholic children were being formed in subjectivities that were not completely congruent with a lot of American expectations. So, yeah, I think it fits quite well with this. Now, it's not true anymore, I don't think, although I'm not sure that that's the case either, but I don't study contemporary Catholic schools. I have spent a lot of time studying Catholic schools from the late 19th into the 20th centuries, and a lot of what went on was to give children an apprehension deep in their bodies, a realization deep in their bodies of the realness of the angels, the realness of the saints, present to them in the circumstances of everyday life, that was embedded in their bodies. So Catholic schools were kind of engines of religion too.
Where would Judaism fit? Would only Reformed Judaism be in the religion and Orthodox in the gods, or is there room for differences there?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, I'm putting orthodoxy and I'm putting the Haredim on the side of religion too, because of all the ways that the presence of their rebbes to them, the ways in which they enact the kind of religious evidence, the kind of religious sensibility that I'm talking about. And I don't mean these to be, again, I don't mean these to be absolute. I said we should hold on to them for heuristic purposes. So there's all kinds of mixing, but we need a consciousness that this is going on before we could track the mixing. So I think there's mixing in families, there's mixing in congregations, people can move back and forth between these ways of being religious. But clearly Reformed Judaism is very much on the side of religion one, would fall very much on the religion one. It was explicitly an effort to remake Judaism I don't need to tell you this, in conformity with the Enlightenment. Orthodoxy is more like what I'm calling religion two, or religion without the quotation marks.
Can I take the opportunity to ask a question?
And we have somebody right in the middle too.
Never mind. Yeah.
I know that you, first of all, I enjoyed your talk tremendously.
Thank you.
And I know that we have to talk in a certain language and use certain words. And you started out by defining what you meant by the word that you were using in brackets and not in brackets.
Right.
So my understanding of the word religion is an I, thou. And we have to talk to it in this context, in an it, that's over there, that's it, that's religion. My understanding of religion is I, thou, and I'm one part of it and God is the other part of it.
Yeah.
And you guys are outside it. That's all. I'm not saying it in an offensive way. I'm saying that you're talking about it, but religion, as I understand it, is not an it. It's an I-thou relationship between me and God, and you have one too, and I don't know it.
Right.
Because it's yours.
Right.
That's all I think we have to have some humility in discussing religion and realize the extent to which we analyze it, that the very nature of an analysis means we're already off the mark.
I don't know about that. I respectfully, I take the question, but I think I may have to disagree, at least with that last comment, that analysis automatically gets us off the mark. I mean, it can, and it often does, but I'm not sure that it needs to, that there isn't a way of talking about religion and close to the texture of people's experience that doesn't do the kind of sort of abstracting that you're talking about and you're rightly criticizing. As for the I-thou question, I fully think that religion is relational. And this is one of my major sort of notions of understanding religion and how I proceed when I think about religion in history and in contemporary practice. I think of it as relational, but I would only insist that the relationships include beings other than humans. And it includes a whole range of beings in many different religions that can't be left out of the picture. So, for example, when I read accounts, say, of Pentecostal social services, and these, I mean, so historians love, they love it when religious, well, they love the civil rights movement because this is religion doing its moral political thing. And so they love religion and so, but these movements are movements that have an ontological foundation to them. They're not simply social movements in clerical garb or something. They are social movements premised upon people's relationships in one way or another with these beings. And I think that it changes the history if we keep that in mind.
First, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I was just wondering how you would classify someone like Dorothy Day, where is she a transitional figure between the old and the new, and yet, of course, she's going back to the gospel,
right?
The whole Catholic worker movement.
Well, first of all, thank you for the question. And what I love about the question is that you're thinking with my categories, which is great. So which of these is Dorothy Day? And I think that's a great question. I think Dorothy Day Dorothy Day in many ways is a mixture of one and two, to use this language that I've fallen onto here, religion and religion. Dorothy Day is often, she's often mobilized as an exemplar of a particularly modern kind of religious consciousness, one that is socially active, one that is concerned with ethics, one that is political, engaged in social movements, and so on. What all of those treatments of Dorothy Day, which is how historians often represent her, Catholic historians and others often represent her, leave out, is Dorothy Day had a robust devotion and a simple devotion to the Virgin Mary, for example. And that she was constantly talking to saints and praying, and that was a fundamental part of who Dorothy Day was. That in fact she became attracted to the Catholic Church in the first place because she saw the religious practices of Italian immigrants. So Dorothy Day is very interesting because she's both a paradigmatic modernist in some ways who comes into Catholicism. She's attracted to Catholicism because of these non-modern things that she's seeing in it, or other than modern things that she's seeing. And you see how difficult it is to talk about this without falling into normative terminology. But she retains a very powerful devotional piety throughout her political career. And I think she is misunderstood if she is understood simply as a labor activist or simply as a social activist. And this other part of her is left out because we don't know how to deal with it historically, socially, conceptually, critically, whatever. You had a question.
I did. Can you tell us about what you're working on now, about the prayers of people who were sexually abused
Right.
by
So
clerics?
my current project, so I'm trying to finish this book of essays, and along the way, I have been studying the religious lives of people who were abused as children by priests. And the question that I have brought to that research is whether or not what happens to the relationship with God and what happens to the relationship with angel. I mean, Catholic children, so all the people I'm talking to grew up in Catholicism at a time when the supernatural world was very close to everyday life. And they, as I was saying earlier in response to that question, they were very much raised to think of themselves as in communication with the saints and with the dead and with angels and so forth. And my question has been, what happens when in the middle of that world, a figure whose identity, and I meant to ask you this about Orthodox priests, but Catholic priests, as many of you may know, are not like Protestant pastors definitionally. So Catholic priests are understood within Catholicism to be members of an ontologically distinct order of human beings that are different from other human beings. The theology of the priesthood, which was very high, maintains this distinction. So Catholic priests are both human and something not human. There's a kind of, talk about those 3D things. I mean, there is a dimension of that to this. So my question has been, what happens to people's religious lives? What happens to their relationships with the world of the spirits when they have been abused as children? And that's what I've been working on now for 2 years, talking to groups of adults and working with them to talk about their life stories and their histories, and in particular the histories of their relationships with various beings in their lives, how these broke, how these were reformed, repaired, if they were repaired, how they think of God and how they think of other angels and so on. That's what I've been working on. So trying to bring this research, this perspective of mine into this question.